Every morning, millions of us stand under a stream of hot water, lather up with perfumed soap, and scrub ourselves clean. It's so routine, you probably don't even think about it. But once upon a time, staying clean was anything but routine. In fact, the idea of daily washing would have seemed downright absurd. And yet, medieval people, peasants and nobles alike, weren't the filthy barbarians you've been led to believe. People bathed, they changed clothes, they even used perfume. But the reasons why, and how they did it, are tangled up in a web of religion, superstition, and good old-fashioned social hierarchy. So, what did they get right? What did they get horribly wrong? And how did it change the world? Let's take a closer look at medieval hygiene. It's the 14th century. You're a noble, you've got money, land, and a fancy title. But you haven't had a proper bath in weeks. Why? Because heating enough water for a full soak is an ordeal involving servants, firewood, and patience. So what do? Well, if you're lucky, you take a bath in a large wooden tub filled with warm water infused with herbs. Lavender, rosemary, maybe even rose petals if you're feeling extravagant. And for some extra cleanliness, a linen cloth dipped in scented water, dabbed carefully across the skin. It's not exactly a modern spa, but in a world without deodorant, it'll do. Meanwhile, if you're a peasant, the equation changes. No servants, no rose petals, no tub. Instead, you find a river, a stream, or if you're really fancy, a wooden barrel filled with rainwater. Soap? A rough concoction made from animal fat and ashes. Harsh? Absolutely. Effective? Well, it's better than nothing. But here's where things get interesting. Bathhouses. Not just for the rich, but for anyone who could pay the entry fee. These were the medieval equivalent of a social club. A place to clean up, catch up on the latest gossip, and maybe even strike a business deal. That is, until things started to smell a little off. See, people started to notice that those who bathed frequently sometimes got sick. And during the Black Death, this led to a rather unfortunate conclusion. Maybe water was the problem. Maybe all this bathing was actually making people ill. The solution? Simple. Stop washing altogether. Instead, rub yourself with scented oils and powders. Layer on the perfume. Mask. Don't clean. This little misunderstanding led to a fashion trend that lasted for centuries. Why wash when you can smell expensive? Which, by the way, is why your 18th century French aristocrat smelled more like a walking apothecary than a human being. This doesn't look like much, does it? Just a simple piece of linen. But in medieval Europe, this was the height of hygiene technology, if you could afford it. You see, the wealthy had a secret weapon in the battle against body odor: linen undergarments. Soft, light, and absorbent, they soaked up sweat and oil, keeping the outer layers clean. And since they were easy to wash, the rich simply changed their linens more often instead of washing their bodies. Meanwhile, the peasants wore wool or hemp, tough, practical, but not exactly breathable, and certainly not easy to wash. So instead of changing clothes daily, they made do with a simple trick: layers. By wearing a long tunic over a coarse shirt, they kept the worst of the dirt away from their skin, at least most of the time. But what about the smell? Well, they had a solution for that too. Herbs. Lavender, sage, and mint were stuffed into pouches, sewn into garments, or simply rubbed on the skin. A medieval version of deodorant. Practical, cheap, and surprisingly effective. But it was about more than just hygiene. Clothes were a status symbol. If you were rich, you flaunted your wealth with layers of fine linen and wool dyed in vivid colors. Why? Because only the wealthy could afford to keep multiple sets of expensive clothing clean. This obsession with linen wasn't just about staying clean. It was about showing off. You see, linen was imported from Flanders, the best in Europe. The more you wore, the richer you looked. And because it was so absorbent, it made washing less necessary, which meant you could afford even more layers. A perfect cycle of wealth and status. The demand for clean linen created an entire industry. Hard-working women who washed and scrubbed with handmade soap, battling stains with lye and elbow grease. It was grueling work, but it also gave them a unique power. Access to the secrets of the nobility. After all, nothing reveals more about a person than their dirty laundry. Ah, the sweet smell of medieval progress. Or rather, the lack of it. You see, back in the Middle Ages, people didn't just live close to each other. They lived close to their waste, and they weren't exactly shy about it. If you were wealthy, you used a chamber pot, basically a portable toilet. Convenient? Yes. Hygienic? Well, that depended on where you emptied it. In most towns, that meant straight out of the window and into the street. And if you were unlucky enough to be walking by, well, you quickly learned to look up and step lively. But what about all the other waste? Food scraps, animal dung, broken pottery, it all ended up in the same place, the street. And with no underground sewage system, waste flowed through open gutters, mixing with rainwater and creating a stagnant, foul-smelling sludge. But as cities grew, the problem became impossible to ignore. More people meant more waste, and soon the streets were clogged. Local authorities introduced the first sanitation laws, banning waste dumping in public areas and creating designated refuse pits. In Paris, you could even be fined for tossing rubbish into the Seine. Forward thinking, right? And then came the muckrakers, medieval sanitation workers tasked with clearing the streets. Armed with shovels, carts, and a strong stomach, they hauled waste out of the cities, dumping it beyond the walls or selling it to farmers as fertilizer. Recycling medieval style. We've come a long way from tossing chamber pots into the street. Today, we scrub, rinse, flush, and disinfect, all in the name of hygiene. It's funny, isn't it? The messy struggle to manage waste did more than just clean the streets. It shaped cities, public health, and even the way we live today. Which just goes to show, history really is a load of, well, you get the idea.